Throughout history, there have been many queens who suffered terrifying deaths. In England, during the medieval period, there were many women who served their husbands well as queen consorts, but they did not tend to live too long, and the expectation was that their husbands would then find someone new. Even when the first Tudor Queen, Elizabeth of York, died, her husband considered marrying a rather inappropriately aged young princess, but he was then advised against this. He even considered marrying his former daughter-in-law at one point, but instead married Catherine of Aragon off to his other son. Elizabeth of York herself had suffered a harrowing death following giving birth, but there were other queens who suffered awful deaths, and even centuries later, Queen Victoria had a number of strokes which led to her being incredibly sick and ill. Her family could not comprehend that the elderly queen died, but there were other tragic deaths of English queens who suffered in the final moments of their lives, and in this documentary we will look at the deaths of some of these women. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 22nd of January 1901, inside of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria took her last breaths. She was a queen who had reigned over Britain for a very long time, and her death was a huge problem for the nation that she reigned over, and the lands that she oversaw. It was a long time since a king or queen had died, and there was no one around who had any recollection of royal funerals and state funerals, and because of this there was a huge amount of panic regarding Victoria's funeral and death. However, inside of her bedroom, inside of her favourite residence, the queen who had ruled for a massive 63 years died surrounded by her family. She had in her final years not been very well, and she had suffered with depression following the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert. However, what was the story of the dreadful death of Queen Victoria? Queen Victoria believed that the year 1900 was her worst year, as the Boer War, which was being fought between the British and Africa, was causing her turmoil, and she was very anxious about this. Her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, was also shot at by a young boy who was protesting the conflict when he was in Belgium, but her eldest daughter Becky, the Dowager Empress of Germany, was also suffering very badly with breast cancer, which had been spreading to different areas of her body, and she was now inside of a German castle in a lot of pain. There was further upset as she was told in the August of 1900 that her favourite son, Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, had died from throat cancer, caused by his heavy drinking and the fact he was a chain smoker. Victoria wrote of this, "Oh God, my poor Alfie, gone too soon, my third grown-up child. It is hard at 81. However, there was even more bad news on the horizon for Queen Victoria, as her beloved grandson, Prince Christian Victor, the son of her daughter, Princess Helena, died when he was away with the British Army in South Africa, as he contracted a fever. But then, towards the end of the year, Victoria's best friend, Jane, Lady Churchill, was found dead in her bed when she was visiting Queen Victoria at Osborne House. All of this news affected the Queen very negatively, and she was not very well herself. She was 81, which was remarkable by the standard of the Victorian period, and she was once a feisty woman, but this spark was going. Victoria was not eating as well as she had previously, and she lost a lot of weight in a short amount of time. She was also stuck in a wheelchair and could not see well, and she often was very confused. For over 60 years she had reigned, and no one in Britain had known anything about a time with her not on the throne. She had reigned for such a long time, and they didn't know any different, but the children of Queen Victoria could not accept that she was ill, and there were no preparations at all made regarding her death. Victoria, in one of her final diary entries, wrote, "Another year has begun, and feeling so weak and unwell that I enter upon it sadly." The Queen was inside of Osborne House, her residence on the Isle of Wight, and she spent her final days there, and the Queen, whilst inside of her bedchamber, was getting more ill, and the royal doctors knew what was on the horizon. Her family, however, did not want to believe what was occurring, and her doctor, Sir James Reed, who had been Victoria's doctor for years, knew what was coming. The The royal family did not believe that she could ever die, and Princess Helena and Beatrice tried to keep everything as normal as they could, and they expected her to recover. The doctors treating Victoria argued amongst themselves, and a number of members of the royal family were reluctant to go to Osborne when they were ordered. The Prince of Wales was even disappointed that he had to cancel his weekend plans, and he was of course the heir to the throne. Also, the Duke of Cognaut was en route to Berlin to celebrate 200 years of the Prussian monarchy, and he had to turn back, but others were even at the theatre. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany was summoned from Germany, and he cancelled any celebrations, and he travelled to the Isle of Wight. He also forced the royal family to make the news of the Queen's deteriorating condition public, to prepare the nation. The announcement shocked the people of Britain, and the world, once new headlines said that Queen unconscious, sinking fast. The press had never really handled a story of such weight, and they even speculated and claimed Victoria was getting better. But the Queen could not herself accept that death was on the horizon. She asked Sir James Reed if she was getting better and said, "I would like to live a little longer, as I have a few things to settle." Her doctor replied, "Yes, your Majesty has been very ill, but you are better now." This could have been the feeling some people have before death and before they go downhill, as they claim they are feeling better. But from the 17th of January 1901, Queen Victoria had a number of very serious strokes, and the entire royal family was rapidly ordered to get to Osborne House and to the Queen's bedside. The government business came to a stop as the Queen could not do her work and duties, and there were talks of her son being made regent in the meantime. But there was not enough time to sort this. Calls were being made to the house every minute from the newspapers for updates, and people began to gather outside of the gates of Osborne House. Victoria was surrounded by her family in her small bedroom, and the Bishop of Winchester and the rector of the local church prayed for her, and hymns were sung. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, and the German Emperor was also by her side, and the Queen could not see, and she said, "Sir James, I am very ill." Constant reassurance came from her doctor, and he said she would get better. But this was not a good sight for members of the royal family, and seeing the once strong Queen Victoria in this way was very distressing for them, and there was a huge amount of crying. Each son, daughter and grandchild, one by one, was summoned into the bedroom to kiss the Queen's hand and to say goodbye. At 6:30 in the evening, on the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died in her bedroom in Osborne House at the age of 81. The news of her death came out before the new King Edward VII had been formally accepted of the crown. An announcement was placed on the gates of the house, and the news then travelled around the world, and newspapers began to print memorial editions, and the windows of shops were covered in black mourning cloth. But there was a lot of panic, and no one knew how to plan a state funeral or the procedure for this. There was a lot of panic in government, and Victoria had requested a full military state funeral. She did not want to be embalmed, and she did not want to lie in state, and she wished for white ponies to pull the gun carriage that her coffin was placed on. She also asked to be buried away from Westminster and St George's Chapel, and instead inside of the mausoleum in Frogmore with her husband Albert. Kaiser Wilhelm II had ordered a death mask to be cast of Victoria's face, which was against her wishes, and this offended the British royal family. However, the Duke of York was also very ill, and the royal undertaker had arrived from London, but there was a problem as they forgot the coffin. There was a local man, however, who was asked to make the coffin for the longest reigning monarch that Britain had ever seen at the time, and it was also said that there was chaos, but the coffins was then sent to Osborne House. The Dr. James Reed, along with Victoria's dresser, Mrs. Tuck, helped to prepare the Queen's body. Victoria did not want to be embalmed, and the floor of the coffin was scattered with charcoal to stop smell of decay, and her hair was cut, and she was dressed in a white silk dressing gown, and on this was her garter ribbon and star. Victoria's wedding veil was also placed over her face, and following this the Kaiser and the new king lifted her body into the coffin, and a final goodbye was said to Victoria as the lid of the coffin was placed on top. There has also been a number of secret items, such as the wedding ring of her Scottish servant and favourite, John Brown, which was placed on Victoria's finger, along with a lock of Brown's hair. The funeral procession of Queen Victoria was large, and her cortege crossed the Solent, and a huge number of soldiers were sent to London for the procession. It was the biggest state occasion since the Duke of Wellington's funeral, and it lasted 2 hours. But during this, the coffin almost fell off the carriage, and there was a lot of drama. Some archbishops arrived to the funeral service too early, and the nave was half empty inside of the chapel, and more people needed to have been invited. But Victoria was then interred inside of the mausoleum in Frogmore by the side of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, who died many decades before. But Queen Victoria was a queen who oversaw a huge amount of change across the nation and her empire. She was seen as a large part of the Industrial Revolution and the cultural shifts that came with it, and she also was the head of the British Empire when it was in the height of its power and influence. Victoria was also regarded as the Empress of India, and after reigning for 63 years in Britain, she died inside of her favourite house. One of the most brilliant and spectacular monarchs to ever have ruled over England was Queen Elizabeth I, and during her reign it was said that there was a golden age across the nation. But despite Elizabeth's time on the throne bringing a number of positives to England, she was a woman who could be ruthless and violent herself. Elizabeth I was a queen who said she was married to her nation and country, but she was not afraid to make decisions that would send people to their deaths. She executed Mary, Queen of Scots, an anointed Scottish monarch, and her cousin, who served as a threat to her. This would haunt Elizabeth even on her deathbed. But Elizabeth I's demise and death was one which was a long departure from her spirited and positive former self, and the Queen suffered greatly with depression in her final days. But what is the story of the dreadful death of Queen Elizabeth I? Elizabeth I was the final Tudor monarch, and she did not have any children, leading to a problem about who would be the king or queen after her. Decisions were made to approach the Scottish King James to become James I of England, and he did accept this. Interestingly, James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the very woman that Elizabeth I executed. But medical treatments, even for the wealthy and the royals during this period, were still very poor, as doctors were considered quacks and they were using medieval remedies and treatments such as bleeding and purging. But Elizabeth I was not always an image of Gloriana, and she was sick a number of times throughout her life. She suffered from the deadly diseases of smallpox, and with this she was left scars on her face. These concerned her greatly. She worried about her beauty, and she was concerned that these blemishes and problems would lead to her not finding a husband. She even ordered painters to paint over the scars and to make the images of her without them. But as she aged, she was not an image of youth and beauty anymore, and one ambassador who visited her court noted that her teeth are very yellow and unequal. Many of them are missing, so that one cannot understand her easily when she speaks quickly. But Elizabeth I reigned for around 45 years, which was a huge achievement during the Tudor period. In her final years, she became very depressed and sad, especially as many of her close friends and ladies passed away. In 1590, Blanche Parry, her closest lady-in-waiting, died, and Parry was the chief gentlewoman of the Queen's privy chamber, and was also said to have been the keeper of the Queen's jewels. She had known the Queen since she was just a child, and she did everything that Elizabeth wanted, and Blanche Parry was seen as a baroness, and her death hit Elizabeth incredibly hard. But then in 1598, another one of her closest friends and her most senior advisors, Cecil, died. He had been by the Queen's side throughout most of her reign and through many different tough times, and had supported her even when she was young. The deaths of these people that the Queen had held in deep regard hit her hard, and then she became more withdrawn and reclusive. but she still served with ruthlessness. She oversaw the execution of her former favourite, Robert Devereux, a man who many believed could have possibly been a husband for Elizabeth, despite the rather large age gap. Devereux had been convicted of high treason for his rebellion and insurrection, and he was deemed as a traitor, and he lost his head on Tower Hill in front of a large crowd. But in the January of 1603, Queen Elizabeth I was not very well, and she was not in a good mood at all. The Queen retired to Richmond Palace, which was one of her favourite homes, and this was a place where she felt very comfortable, and in her final months and days she surrounded herself with her loyal ladies and other attendants. She turned her back on food and drink, and also lost a lot of weight, and Elizabeth's ladies then became very concerned about her. They knew what was on the horizon, and despite appealing to Elizabeth to allow doctors into her quarters, Elizabeth refused any treatment. But another death also caused further upset, as Catherine Howard's death hurt the Queen, and she was a woman who had served Elizabeth for 45 years, and she died very suddenly. This may have been the final nail in the coffin of the last Tudor Queen, and it was said regarding this that the Queen loved the Countess well, and hath much lamented her death, remaining ever since in a deep melancholy that seemeth to be overtaken. But in the February of 1603, Elizabeth I remained in this very severe depression, and she was no way near her former self. Elizabeth was the Queen who had defeated the Spanish Armada and inspired her nation to victory, but now she was vacant most of the time, and she was approaching 70 and was very frail. The Queen continued to refuse to rest when she attended court, and her ladies were concerned that she would fall, so they laid pillows all over her bedchambers in case she did have a fall. There were more deaths of her ladies, including Lady Knollys and also Catherine Grey, the Countess of Nottingham, but Elizabeth had enough of life. She was constantly upset, and in the March of 1603 she fell sick herself. She would sit on her cushions for hours on end, motionless and in deep thought, and she was pondering her life during these episodes and moments, and she may have been regretting her decisions to carry out the executions of some of her favourites, and in particular Mary, Queen of Scots. It was said that Elizabeth never truly wanted to execute Mary, her cousin, as she believed this would have prevented her from getting into heaven, executing another woman, who would have been sent by God to rule over her kingdom. If she hadn't have done this either, there was a good chance that Mary could have become the Queen of England. One witness said that the Queen shed many tears and sighs, maintaining her innocence, that she never gave consent to the death of that Queen. Elizabeth was even visited by ghostly figures and was haunted by people, including Mary, in her final days. But to everyone, in the March of 1603, it was clear that this would be the Queen's final illness. Her depression, along with her delirium and her overall health, all continued to decline and frail. She took to her bedchambers, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was then summoned to come to her bedside and to pray for her. He told Elizabeth not to worry about the afterlife, and he said that she would go to heaven and she would be looked after by angels, reigning once again in the afterlife. But on the 24th of March 1603, Queen Elizabeth I passed away inside of Richmond Palace. Her body was taken to Whitehall, where it was then held in state, but a number of Elizabeth's final wishes were not adhered to. Elizabeth stipulated that she did not want to be embalmed and eviscerated with her heart and her internal organs removed from her body after death, but this did occur, and it was possibly a good job that this did happen, because when her coffin was moved, there was a very loud crack that was heard from within it, and it was claimed that her body broke open as various gases were released from her decaying corpse. But the explosion even splintered her coffin and some of the wooden shell, and this would have been worse if she hadn't have been disemboweled. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth I occurred on the 28th of April 1603, in which she was laid to rest inside of Westminster Abbey. The funeral procession was huge, and thousands of people came onto the streets of London to pay their last respects. It was said by a witness that there is such a general sighing and groaning and weeping, as the like had not been seen or known in the memory of man. She was a woman who was loved by her people, and she had a very interesting reign over England. Elizabeth I, to begin with, was laid to rest inside of the same vault as her grandfather and grandmother, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the Tudor dynasty. However, she was later moved by James I to be buried inside of a huge tomb that had been made for her, and is laid to rest opposite Mary, Queen of Scots, her infamous rival. Anne of Cleves is said to have been the luckiest wife of King Henry VIII, for she would not lose her head inside of the confines of the Tower of London. But she was a woman who was ridiculed for her looks by the grotesque and large Tudor king, who was significantly older than her. Henry VIII, of course, is remembered for his 6 wives, and his marriage to Anne was nothing short of a sham, as the marriage would be quickly annulled. But it cost the English king a significant amount of money, as Anne was a German princess, and she could not be dealt with quietly, and she was given a huge amount of property and land, including the childhood home of Henry's executed second wife. She would outlive the rest of Henry's wives, including Catherine Parr, the king's 6th and final wife, but she died at the age of 41 inside of Chelsea Manor. But what is the story of her death? The life of Anne of Cleves was rather unnotable until she would be approached to marry. For the English king, she was raised in an affluent German royal family, and the family hoped that she would marry a wealthy European prince, but no one would have guessed that she would marry the English king. Henry VIII, following the death of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, sent Hans Holbein, his royal painter, across to Germany and Europe to paint many women who would become his next wife. Holbein was told to make the images as accurate as he could, and he came to Durham to paint the portraits of Anne and her sister Amalia. These were both considered possible matches for Henry VIII, and the king chose Anne's painting, and by March of 1539 marriage negotiations were being played out between the Cleves family and the English royal household. Thomas Cromwell was placed in charge of overseeing the marriage negotiations, and the king's chief adviser would sign a marriage treaty on Henry's behalf. The king paid a dowry of 100,000 florins to Anne's brother, but she was not the king's normal type. Henry wanted a woman who valued education and culture, but Anne was not this. She was very important, but she was not the best educated, and she preferred practical skills such as needlework, and she was skilled at playing cards. She could only read and write in German, but she was calm and gentle, and the French ambassador said of her that she was tall and slim, but of middling beauty and a very assured and resolute countenance. It is considered that Anne of Cleves was rather attractive, and that she had fair hair and a nice face. A chronicler at the time said that her hair hanging down, which was fair yellow and long, she was apparelled after the English fashion, with a French hood, which she set forth her beauty and good visage, that every creature rejoined to behold her. But others claimed that she looked a lot older than she was, and on New Year's Day 1530, Henry VIII met with her in private. He followed the fashionable courtly love tradition, and he entered a room where she was staying in disguise. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, then explained what happened, saying next, Henry so went up into the chamber where the said Lady Anne was looking out of a window to see the bull baiting which was going on in the courtyard, and suddenly he embraced and kissed her, and showed her a token which the king had sent for her New Year's gift, and she, being abashed and not knowing who it was, thanked him, and so spoke with her. But she regarded him little, but always looked out the window, and when the king saw that she took so little notice of his coming, he went into another chamber, and took off his cloak, and came in again in a coat of purple velvet, and when the lords and knights saw his grace, they did him reverence. This was not good, and the first encounter and meeting was a disaster, as Anne of Cleves did not recognise her future husband, and she certainly did not know that Henry was the king. She was hoping to be married to a younger and more attractive king, but Henry was at this point not that. Henry was hugely disappointed and also very embarrassed, and it was by the standards of the 16th century a catfishing. But Henry and Anne would meet officially near to Greenwich Park, which a huge reception took place at, but the king had been put off marriage. But it was too late, and Henry had to go through with it, despite him tasking Cromwell to try and find him a loophole. He felt that he had not been bowled over by Anne of Cleves' appearance and beauty, and this would be the reason that he would not, allegedly, consummate his marriage with her. Cromwell struggled to find a loophole and a way out for Henry, and he would ultimately pay the price and would lose his head for this. But the king had to marry Anne of Cleves on the 6th of January 1540, and this took place inside the Palace of Placentia. The couple's wedding night did not go well, and they did not sleep together either. And the following month, Anne would state of her husband that, "When he comes to bed, he kisseth me, and he taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me good night, sweetheart. And in the morning, he kisseth me, and biddeth farewell, darling." But Anne would quickly be forced out of the royal court after around 6 months of marriage. She was told Henry was reconsidering his position, and consent was given to annul the marriage, as it was a complete disaster. The annulment went through on the 12th of July 1540, but this would cost the king very heavily. Now, following the annulment, in the settlement, Anne of Cleves was given a huge amount of property, land and manors, including Hever Castle, where Anne Boleyn grew up. Throughout his final years, Henry VIII and Anne did grow close, and they became good friends, and she was said to have been the king's beloved sister. And she often came to court, and Henry did value her company. But following the execution of his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, there were many people who said that Henry VIII should remarry Anne of Cleves, but this never happened, and he instead turned his attention to Catherine Parr, a woman Anne did not like. In the years following, Anne remained very comfortable, and then following Henry's death and his son's death, during Mary I's reign, she would send her congratulations to Mary with regards to her marriage to Philip of Spain. She also took part in Mary's coronation, and this was one of the last public appearances she made. She did fall from favour slightly during Mary's reign, as many believed she was linked to the Wyatt rebellion due to the closeness she had with Elizabeth I, or Princess Elizabeth, as she was at the time. She was then forced to live a quiet life in her households, but she never left England. This is where Anne of Cleves' story became rather tragic. She would long to return home to her homelands and family, but she never managed to do this, and she was very homesick. She missed her sister and her other family members. However, by the July of 1557, it was clear that Anne of Cleves was very ill. She had been ill for months and could not get out of bed, and with this it was then time to draft her will. She said in this that all of the money she had should go to the members of her household and her servants, including her ladies, grooms and gentlemen of the house. She wanted them to receive her wealth and to benefit from her death, and she named every single member of the household by name, and she asked for the Queen to make sure that these people were comfortable following her death. Her jewellery was given to her family, but she left rings and other jewels to her stepdaughters Queen Mary I and Princess Elizabeth. Inside of Chelsea Old Manor, alone and missing home on the 16th of July 1557, Anne of Cleves died. It's believed that for months she had been fighting cancer, but despite dying in obscurity, she was given a large funeral, as she was, after all, briefly a queen consort of England. It was said of her funeral that, "The 3rd day of August, my Lady Anne of Cleves, sometime wife to Henry VIII, came from Chelsea to be buried in Westminster, with all the children of Westminster and many priests and clerks, and the monks of Westminster, and my Lord Bishop of London, and my Lord Abbot of Westminster rode together. Many of the prominent politicians of the time attended, and there were 100 torches burning, being carried by her servants. The procession was huge and large, and she was then taken into Westminster Abbey. Her coffin was then taken to her tomb, and she was interred with a cloth of gold laid over her. Following this, the officers of her household broke their staves of office and threw them into the tomb. The most horrific part of Anne of Cleves' death was the fact she was a young woman who was thousands of miles from home. She had been brought over to a foreign country to marry a man she had never met, and a man who was brutal, grotesque and evil. The match between Henry VIII and Anne was poor, but Anne was forced to remain in England due to the properties she held and the settlement that she received following their failed marriage. But she is considered lucky, as by the standards of Henry VIII's wives, she managed to keep her head, and she did accumulate a significant amount of wealth. But I'm sure Anne of Cleves would have traded this to go back home and to marry someone who she genuinely loved. One of the most savage queens to have ever ruled England was Mary I. She became known as Bloody Mary, as she burned over 200 Protestants at the stake during her short 5-year reign of the country. She was the eldest child of King Henry VIII, and many believed that she was as brutal as her father could be. But she was a woman who was driven by her religious convictions. She was also a very sick woman, and throughout her life she encountered a number of health problems that led to her dying at the age of 42. One of the biggest issues that plagued Mary was her inability to become pregnant, and she blamed Protestants on this, and that's why she punished them extremely harshly. But on the 17th of November 1558, inside the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Mary I died, and it would be her half-sister Elizabeth who would succeed her. But what is the story of the death of Mary I? Now, Mary wrote in 1552 to the council of her half-brother, King Edward VI, and she said, "My health is more unstable than that of any creature, and I have all the greater need to rejoice in the testimony of a pure conscience." It's likely that Mary's health throughout her life was impacted by the huge amount of stress she was put under, even during her early life. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was the first wife of King Henry VIII, and she had a sharp but very distressing downfall. Henry VIII, Mary's father, had fallen for Anne Boleyn at a much younger woman who served as Mary's lady-in-waiting. However, he needed a petition to Rome to get a divorce. This would not be granted, and Henry later decided to declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and banished Catherine, Mary's mother, from her household. Catherine was banned from seeing Mary, her daughter, and the pair would not see each other again. Catherine of Aragon was heartbroken by being prevented from seeing Mary, and this caused her great upset. But Mary was profoundly affected by this. She lived on a diet of stress and nervous tension, and this did not make her very well. She was a thin and frail lady who had red hair and very fair complexion. She allegedly had a loud and deep voice and was rather short-sighted and struggled to see. She also had her father's temper and could be very stubborn. It's believed that as an infant her health was nothing out of the ordinary, and she lived a comfortable life in the royal nursery and was given a brilliant education. But in Spain, 1528, she suffered from a bout of smallpox, but emerged from this rather positively. It wasn't recorded that she was scarred from smallpox, unlike her half-sister Elizabeth I was, but when she entered puberty around the age of 14, Mary began to suffer greatly. She complained of many pains from her head and also her stomach, and there were many occasions where she constantly was sick for periods of up to 2 weeks. She could not keep any food down, and as she was Henry VIII's daughter, the best royal doctors would tend to her, and different physicians and apothecaries were brought in to treat her. Mary was diagnosed with something recorded as strangulation of the womb, and this had a number of symptoms, including issues with her periods, a depressed mental state, issues with breathing, and pain and swelling of the abdomen. Because of this, she also suffered from headaches, lack of appetite, fainting, nausea, and vomiting. This was all incredibly stressful for the young girl, who was having to deal with much despite being a young girl. She had also been written out of the line of succession, which would have affected her. By right, she should have succeeded Henry VIII, but she was written out because of the dissolution of Henry's marriage with her mother. Mary later went to live with her half-sister Elizabeth, and as part of her treatment she often rode on horseback, but she was then in a sense kept under house arrest, as the Act of Succession banishing her from the throne was passed. She was practically held under house arrest, and Mary was ordered not to call herself a princess or label her mother as a queen. And she was threatened with execution and a stay inside of the Tower in London if she did this. However, weeks before her 19th birthday, she became very ill. She was placed under the care of Lady Shelton, whose treatment of her in a sense was very harsh. Mary had headaches and stomach cramps again, and Lady Shelton fetched an apothecary who was new in. She was prescribed a number of pills which actually made Mary much worse, and they made her fight for her life. She could have had an allergic reaction to what was inside of them, or some response which placed her body into a state of shock, but Lady Shelton was worried that she would be accused of trying to poison the king's eldest child, and she worried that she would go to the executioner's block. Even some of the royal doctors refused to treat her, as they did not want to be blamed or linked to her death if she died under their charge, but Thomas Cromwell then sent the king's personal doctor, Dr. Butts, to see Mary. He said that her illness was curable and that she needed to take a course of careful treatment, and that if she had been living in better conditions, then she would have been healthier. Henry refused to relent, but Mary did get better. She was given a special diet and she then did recover, but her illness showed no pattern, and each time she was poorly, the severity of symptoms changed. Many across the land learned about her illness, and European princes and monarchs were hesitant to ask the king to marry Mary, for her health would be such a burden to them. She wrote to Cromwell again and complained again of more issues with her stomach and head, but she did return to her father's household, and she served as the chief mourner for Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, at her funeral. But she had very bad toothache, and this was then pulled out. She was severely ill in the winter of 1557, and she was so sick that she could not stand or sit for long, and she became very faint. She also then, a few years later, had a fever that caused her heart palpitations, and she was so ill that many thought she was on death's door. It took her a while to recover, but she got there. She would accompany Henry VIII and his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, on their honeymoon, but she then got sick and returned back for the comfort of home. She experienced more fever in 1547, and her mood and mental state got much worse. After her father's death and the accession of Edward VI, Mary was stressed yet again. She, as Catholic, was worried that her half-brother, who was Protestant, could have her killed, and she lived under the constant fear of imprisonment. But Mary would become queen herself, after deposing Edward's successor, Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen. But she then married Philip of Spain on the 25th of July 1554, which did not go down well. People across England feared his Spanish influence, but the most tragic bout of illness would then strike Mary. After the wedding, at the age of 37, she announced she was pregnant. Mary's health got better during pregnancy, but she then went into confinement at Hampton Court. However, there was an announcement on the streets on the 30th of April 1555 that she had given birth to a child, but this was a mistake, and the doctors said there was a miscalculation of her due date. Mary said she was pregnant and insisted on this, but she became very reclusive. Not many courtiers and attendants believed her, and those who waited on her said she looked pale and ill. But she later came round to the fact there was no child, and then the swelling of her belly went down. This was a phantom pregnancy, and Philip then left England to leave Mary to rule her kingdom. He did return, but Mary was yet again ill, with insomnia and melancholy. It was said that the stress of her life made her look 10 years older than she was. But when Philip left England for the last time, Mary believed she was pregnant again, and her stomach was swollen. Mary recovered, but in the January of 1558, England lost Calais to France, and there was great famine across the country, as weather was awful and had ruined crops. There was also a terrible bout of flu which was sweeping through England and was killing people at the same rate as the plague. This illness was one that lingered on, and then the victim would often die. In spring and summer of 1558, Mary was sick again, and in the August she had a low fever and dropsy, and it was said she was in a very bad way. The royal doctors predicted that she would die. Because of this, she moved from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace. Then by September of 1558, Mary had a high fever again, confusion and also headaches, and she then went almost completely blind. She had a fever which would last days, and more bad moods made her feel worse. But by October, it was clear she would not recover, and she made her will.
Mary tried to do what she could to rule England, but it was clear to everyone she did not have long left. In early November she did seem to get a little better, and she then named Elizabeth, her half-sister, her successor. She then drifted in and out of consciousness and would wait for her death. She got very weak, and many of her household staff switched to go and serve Elizabeth I to try and secure a place in the new Queen-to-be's household. But some servants stayed loyal to Mary, and they tended to her in her final moments. She prayed for her salvation, and she described these incredible dreams she was having whilst she was unconscious. She said she saw angels before her, and this gave her comfort. She heard Mass in the early part of the 17th of November 1554, but then she died peacefully between 4 and 5 in the morning. There have been a number of suggestions as to what killed Mary, and one of them is that she suffered from ovarian dropsy. This condition is where cysts form on the ovaries, and it creates terrible abdominal pains and swelling, and it can be linked to the growth of cancerous tumours. Another theory that had been put forward is that she suffered from a tumour of the pituitary gland, and it was said that some women diagnosed with this can have problems with depression, bleeding, and issues with stomach pains. But it has also been suggested that the violent bout of flu which was sweeping through England could have caused her death. But Mary I was a queen who, despite reigning for just 5 years, had a huge impact on the landscape of England. She restored Catholicism briefly, and launched a campaign of persecution against her enemies.
The father and mother of the Tudor dynasty were Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Their marriage ultimately ended the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that saw the House of York and the House of Lancaster at war for decades. When Henry VII agreed to marry Elizabeth of York, he was just seen as a rebel in many people's eyes, but he managed to defeat Richard III and then take the throne. Elizabeth married Henry after his coronation, and the pair had 4 children who lived past infancy. But despite seemingly being enemies when they married, the pair were happily married and were known to be very devoted to each other. But on the 11th of February 1503, Elizabeth of York died whilst inside the Tower of London. In the following decades, at the orders of her son, 2 more queens would lose their lives in the Tower of London, the same place where his mother passed away. Elizabeth of York's passing plunged Henry VII into great depression and upset. In 1502, Elizabeth of York, despite being happily married and the mother of a number of children, fell pregnant again, and was then forced into her confinement period. This occurred inside the Tower of London, which was at the time regarded as a royal palace and a residence, and not really a prison or a feared place. Her room inside the fortress was a beautiful one, and had been decorated with rich curtains and tapestries containing images of clouds, flowers and roses. On the 2nd of February 1503, she gave birth to a daughter, who she named Catherine after Catherine of Aragon, the widow of her son Arthur Tudor, and the future wife of her other son Henry VIII. However, the child, a few days old, passed away from an illness. But 9 days after giving birth, Elizabeth of York died from postpartum infection. Her death shattered the royal family. Her husband, the King of England, was destroyed by what happened. It was said that Elizabeth's death broke the heart of her husband and shattered him. Another source says how Henry VII privily departed to a solitary place, and would no man should resort unto him. Elizabeth's death and the reaction from Henry VII shocked his closest attendants. The king, who was rarely a man of emotion except when he was very angry, was overwhelmed with grief, and this surprised his attendants, and he was sobbing openly. Following Elizabeth's death, he shut himself away for a number of days, and he refused to speak to anyone. Her death impacted him severely. Now, following her death, the king became very ill himself and would not allow anyone but his mother, Margaret Beaufort, to care for him. He even dismissed doctors, but he did recover. The Tower of London was abandoned as a place of royal residence, and because of it being a place where Elizabeth of York died. And following this, it became more of a site of imprisonment, especially during the reign of Henry VIII. After his wife's death, Henry VII became more miserable and was reluctant to spend money, and he lived a very basic life. But he did organise a huge funeral for his wife. 2 council members organised the funeral, his treasurer, the Earl of Surrey, and the controller of his household, Sir Richard Guildford. The citizens of London also helped to contribute, and when she died, the bells of St Paul's Cathedral rang out, and all the other churches across London rang their bells as well. Elizabeth's body was tended to in its chamber at the Tower, and was washed before it was then dressed in her estate robes and was laid out on her bed. Her children were then brought to see her body, and they said their goodbyes. On the same day, her remains were embalmed by the sergeant of the chandlery. He was given many things to perform the job, including cerecloth, balms, spices, sweet wine, and a great amount of wax. Her body was washed with wine and rose water, and rubbed with balm and perfumed spices. Following this, her body was wrapped in cerecloth, and this had been broken down into strips and dipped into wax and then placed on her body. Her body was then enclosed in lead, and was then marked with a lead epitaph containing her name. This lead case was then made of hollywood, and the coffin was covered in black velvet and marked with a cross of white damask. Elizabeth of York's coffin was then carried by people of the highest rank, and it was taken to the chapel of St Peter Advincula within the walls of the Tower of London on the 12th of February. Her ladies and maids of honour followed the coffin and marched side by side and then stayed inside the chapel with the coffin. The chapel was lit by 500 tall candles, with the windows being lined with black material. The coffin was placed in front of the altar. Elizabeth's sister Catherine, the Countess of Devon, took her place by Elizabeth's body, and she stayed whilst Mass was being celebrated. She then went away, and the coffin remained in state where 6 ladies kept a vigil. Catherine was the Queen's chief mourner, and Mass was said for 3 days straight. At night the Lord's Prayer was said, and the coffin remained in the chapel until the day of the funeral procession on the 22nd of February. Her coffin was placed on a carriage at noon, and then was taken out of the Tower of London. The cart was lined with black velvet and blue cloth, and a lifelike effigy was placed above her coffin, and it was clothed in the robes of the estate of a queen, and it had a crown on her head. Her hair flowed down to her shoulders, and she had a spectre in her right hand. Her fingers had gold rings on them, and the procession travelled towards Westminster Abbey, the place of her coronation. Many of London's people witnessed the procession, and many wept for their queen. 200 poor people carried torches and were dressed in black cloth, and this had been paid for by the king himself. Behind them were a number of the Queen's household and the Mayor of London, and 6 horses drew their carriage on its final journey. Behind Elizabeth's carriage, 8 black horses with her ladies of honour rode, and each was led by a man in a black gown. These included the Queen's 4 sisters, and other noble women were in the carriages. Many guilds provided mourning clothes, and some dressed in white and stood holding torches in respect. The Lady Mayoress of London arranged for 37 virgins, 1 for each of Elizabeth's life, to hold burning tapers and to stand in Cheapside out of respect. These women wore white linen and had wreaths on their heads. More torches were given by parish churches, and all the city's churches were draped in black. As the cortege went past a church, a bell would ring. There were many European ambassadors who attended the funeral, and along the route were 500 torches carried by citizens. As it made its way through to St Margaret's churchyard, bishops greeted it. The coffin and effigy were then placed onto a hearse which had black cloth of gold and her motto, "Humble and Reverent in gold," written on it. Banners were draped in the corners of the coffin, and there were other emblems of the Tudor queenship displayed, including a portcullis and gold roses. The coffin then spent the night at Westminster Abbey, surrounded by torchbearers and other observers, and as the coffin lay in state that evening, her sister Catherine presided over a supper of fish inside of the Queen's chambers at Westminster. During the dinner nights, heralds and squires kept a close vigil over the body all night, and over 1,000 candles burned. On the final day of the funeral in the morning, candles around the coffin burnt, whilst the black cloth hung from the roof. There were a number of masses said, and the Bishop of Lincoln gave the final requiem mass. Women were then led to offer their final goodbyes to Elizabeth's body, and they presented a number of offerings to her. After the sermons, the pall and cloth that were draped over the coffin were taken off, and then the final interment was made. The effigy of Elizabeth
was taken from the coffin, and the Bishop of London blessed the grave before the coffin was lowered. Elizabeth's chamberlain and her gentlemen ushers broke their staves of office and threw them into the grave. As the creation of the Tudor tomb for Henry VII had just begun in the Lady Chapel extension of Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth was buried in a vault specifically made for her in the crossing of the abbey between the choir and the high altar. She was then reinterred in a beautiful new tomb following the death of her husband Henry VII in 1509. Henry VII, despite being a tight man who rarely spent much money, spent lavishly on the funeral of his queen. He spent 5 times more money on Elizabeth's funeral than he did for his son Arthur, and spent, in today's money, around £1.5 million on burying his wife. The funeral was a huge ceremony that allowed for a memorable spectacle to occur, and with this all of London joined in. The nobility and the poor all came together to pay tribute to the Queen of England. Elizabeth of York is remembered as the loyal wife of Henry VII, whose marriage ended a civil war. Her death was incredibly tragic and sad, and she was the first queen to die inside of the Tower of London. Later, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Grey would all die inside of the Tower of London,